Welcome to the presentation. I want to clear up one of the most confusing and hotly debated topics in nutrition and basically all of well-being right now in health, and that is UPFs or ultra-processed foods. Now, the reason for that is, I don't know about you, but for me, social media, everything is just getting crazier and crazier and crazier. And it is really hard to figure out what the hell am I supposed to know? What's the truth? What's just somebody fear-mongering to try and sell me something, where they can get their teeth in or get their claws in and try and confuse me about something and they can sell me the solution to it. Because I was tricked by that for a very long time. What is the truth? And can someone actually provide some common sense and some nuance for what is a fairly complex subject? And that is hopefully what I'm going to do today for you. And I'm going to cover everything that you will need to know about UPFs. Are they all bad or simply misjudged? And really, the reason for that is I want you to be able to make your own informed decisions and not be led by what the latest influencer campaign is, or whether they're telling you that protein bars are going to kill you or something stupid like that. So let's get right into it. I've broken the presentation up into four parts. So the first part would actually be needing to understand exactly what UPFs are. So we're going to be looking at the definition of that. We're then going to be peering into the literature around that. So what is the current state of the data? And then looking at some of the mechanisms which may potentially underlie that. Then we're going to look at one of the, I would say, the least talked about elements surrounding UPFs, and that is certain socioeconomic factors and accessibility issues um, that just aren't talked about in that conversation. And one of the reasons why UPFs might actually be quite beneficial and quite important, especially in today's society when we live in a cost of living crisis and all the other issues that we have to contend with on a day-to-day basis. And then finally, the common sense part, I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of context and dose. So, plan is to get through all that in the next 30 minutes, 40 minutes. After the presentation is over, if you have any questions, you can just send them to me and I'll be able to get them answered for you. Okay, but let's jump right into it. So, what exactly are ultra processed foods? Apart from the devil, of course, what exactly are they? And that's just wee jokes. So, ultra processed foods, and the degree to which a food is processed, we define that using something called the NOVA system. So, generally speaking, the NOVA classification system is the most widely used tool that we would use for categorizing foods as it relates to just how processed they are. So, there are four separate groups within the NOVA system. There are unprocessed foods, minimally processed foods, and then ultra processed foods. But the NOVA system is far from perfect. So, for example, the NOVA definition of ultra-processed food does not comment necessarily on the nutritional content of food and is not intended to be used for nutrient profiling or essentially to assign these black and white labels. When someone says that food's bad because it's ultra-processed or that food's good because it's minimally processed, that totally lacks, an understanding of the actual nutritional profile of that food, the context at which it would fit into your diet, and how it's actually going to contribute to the goals that you've got. It's a random label that someone's pulled out of the rear end, and it just doesn't help anyone. So, the NOVA system does not distinguish between nutrient poor and nutrient rich foods. So, for example, here's a good sort of common sort of occurrence that happens with the Nova system. So you take something like a fortified whole grain cereal, which is now fortified with a whole host of things, including the likes of folate. Folate has been shown to reduce the risk of neural tube defects in infants, so it's very important. It's we actually have it fortified now. All of our flour and baked goods are now fortified with folate or folic acid, and that's because of that. So, but again, that's a degree of processing, right? So, but you compare that to something like a chocolate bar, which both fall into the UPF sort of categorization or fall into the UPF bucket. It's easy to say that, those foods are not one and the same, yet they fall into the same categorization. So already we're seeing some faults and flaws in the NOVA system and how we actually group these foods. Now, the next wee thing to talk about is the nuance and unfair grouping. So, another issue with this labeling, and this is likely due to the influence of media, particularly social media, is that these certain categorizations under the NOVA system are now widely associated with just being bad, regardless of the food itself. But not all processing is bad. In fact, a lot of it is actually necessary for safe food consumption and food security. So, a couple of good examples of this, pasteurization for milk. So that helps to reduce the potential for foodborne illness. The fortification, like I had mentioned, so you've got iodized salt, vitamin D in milk, and then folic acid in flour. Like I said, is an incredibly protective tool against neural tube defect in newborns, and then the likes of preservation techniques as well. So canned fruit, canned vegetables, etc. That just extends the shelf life, keeps them safe, and actually helps to retain some of their nutrient profile as well, which all of these things have pretty clear health benefits, but because they would fall under a degree of being more processed, then we would associate that as being bad, and it's just not the case. So it is. So it's really important, to be able to contextualize things, to peer under, if you want to say the umbrella, and to not get so hung up just on labels. Because like people will just attach labels to anything as a means to avoid actually looking at the context. We do it to people, we do it to things. Whenever you label something as good or bad, people don't look beyond that. And that's just not helpful because you're either, at least in the realm of nutrition, you could be losing out on certain foods. You could be losing out on entire food groups. For some people, you end up losing out on entire nutrients. What kind of jokes are we throwing around nowadays where we're still honing in on, carbohydrates are bad or fats are bad? It doesn't make any sense, but yet we do it over and over and over again because we don't like to get overwhelmed with information. We're happy to take that on board, and it's the thing I would say is always come into nutrition, with a curious head on. You want to know why someone has called something that, and then understand if they can't explain the context, which they probably won't be able to. I would not take on board what it is that they're saying because again, it looks good on social media. But in real life, it just doesn't work. So I would do your best to ignore those people as best you possibly can. Um, and then finally, I just want to highlight the pitfalls of Nova inclusivity. So there's the issue of over-inclusiveness. I was going to make a joke there about this being a political statement, but I don't want to go, especially not in this day and age, I do not want to open up that can of worms. So some foods are labeled as UPFs, like protein powders, plant-based milks, or frozen breads, other sort of frozen veggies and things like that there. And these can play really useful roles in modern diets, diets with additional requirements, or diets and lifestyles that are impacted by the cost of living crisis and heavy time restrictions. Unfortunately, the way that the current UPF debate is set up, it severely overlooks, again, these nuances, the context, and it paints all of these foods with the same brush. So as soon as you cross over into that ultra-processed food category, bad. Not true. It is this lack of nuance that actually caused me to struggle for very many years, caused me to struggle severely with my relationship with food, and take a very black and white approach to foods for years and years. Um, it cost me holidays, it cost me birthdays. I was speaking to someone the other day, actually one of my clients, and I said to them, I actually I actually pretended to be sick for multiple Christmases because I was so afraid of the foods that would be on the table. I pretended to eat my Terry's chocolate orange that our parents would give us in our stocking every year. I pretended to eat that. What I did actually was I I'd sort of like chewed a little bit and then spat it back out again. Didn't really know what to do with that. So tried to mush that into like the tinfoil wrapper and then slowly started to like sneak the chocolate into the bin and had to hide it underneath like the wrapping paper and stuff like that. And it was just like, and that was maybe, it was two Christmases, potentially three Christmases, and it was just horrible. It was horrible pretending to be sick on Christmas Day so that you don't eat the food. And I think the only foods I actually ended up eating were maybe like the turkey breast and like the vegetables. And my vegetables, of course, had to be cooked with no oils, no butters, no nothing. And again, it's like it's the slippery slope of this puritanism with food. that leads to issues like orthorexia, which is this sort of obsession with clean eating, which I had. But I mean, like I dealt with everything. I kind of, I've got the t-shirt for just about every single issue you could have had under the sun. But it's just it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this and why we do what we do is like we need to sort of penetrate the health and fitness industry and not allow them to get away with this. We need to bring it back to a common sense approach. It might not impact everyone. Not everyone's going to develop orthorexia. Not everyone's going to start binging. Not everyone's going to develop comfort eating and feeling bad about themselves and have awful relationships with food. But it's enough people. All right. It's enough people. And all these influencers that we put on pedestals, the ones who get triggered by fruit and binge on Jaffa cakes, for example. I've read studies where north of 60% of these people, these influencer demographics, have, if not a completely distorted relationship with their body image, they also have a horrendous relationship with food. And these are the people who we have put on the pedestals, who we listen to. The pariahs and beacons of health, who, to be quite honest, yes, they might look good in a perfectly curated little photo, but under the hood, they're a mess, you know, because they're buying into the same old drivel that everyone else buys into, and then they just end up in the same position. And that's why we need to bring it all back to common sense and just say, we're not dealing with this anymore, you know. So hopefully this presentation does a little bit of a dent in that, but I think it's going to take all of us to start combating this nonsense. So it is. So anyway, I'll get off my own little pedestal and start, stop doing my own little political talk. And then we'll get into, segue on, into the mechanisms and the data around UPFs, because I think this is where it gets interesting. So, what does the data show? Well, let's first look at the observational data. So, observational data, basically, it's the data that typically serves as the foundation for further research. You look at these vast groups of people, you see links between this and this, and you think, well, maybe there's a reason for that, so let's go and explore it. Okay, that's essentially what observational studies are. They don't involve any form of intervention. They don't involve getting, within that group and asking them to do certain things. You've essentially just got a big data set, and you're going to just look at the potential links between these people, and outcomes, and that's kind of what we use to, serve as a foundation for further research. So um, there's many large cohort studies. Cohort studies are essentially observational studies where the participants share a similar characteristic. So, say for example, you've got the UK Biobank, the Nutrinet Sante, the EPIC study, the Nurses Health studies, common ones. So like a common characteristic with the nurses' health study is that they're all nurses, something like that. And a lot of these observational studies have shown that as ultra-processed food intake increased, as or if groups have met a higher threshold for UPF intake, they're in the sort of the higher thresholds of that, that tends to directly correlate then with higher risks of obesity, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, mental health issues, and even certain forms of cancer. So this is kind of where the link has emerged from. We see these groups, we see these issues, we see that they all have diets that are higher in these things, and then everyone starts to panic a little bit, okay? Because quite a vast proportion of the British diet, north of 50% of the British diet, is made up from UPFs. So, what happens next? Now, there is some issues with the observational data. So, one of the major critiques of observational data, however, is that just because there is a correlation, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a direct causal factor there. And this is particularly true when it comes to UPFs. So while there are many ill health effects associated with higher UPF intakes, people who do tend to eat more UPFs also tend to have lower socioeconomic status, which is one of the most, if not the most significant risk factor for a whole host of issues. They tend to smoke more, exercise less, sleep worse, drink more alcohol, and face higher stress levels. So all of these confounding variables have all been associated independently or in groups with a lot of those poor health outcomes that I had sort of quoted before, that are linked towards um, those higher intakes of UPFs. So it's difficult to actually parse out whether the UPFs are the problem or they are just sort of a piece of a much larger conglomerate of issues, that this person is experiencing, which tends to be the case, to be quite honest. So what the data actually shows in control trials. So these are trials whereby you have a group of people, you introduce an intervention, you usually have a control group. So one group does the thing, the other group thinks it's doing the thing or does nothing, or perhaps does a different thing. Then hopefully you'll want to swap those over. And then you want to test it and just see, what is the outcome of that. Now, some of these trials do that, some of them do less than that. Try and find one that does that, where there is that crossover and things like that as well, because that's the best way to truly evaluate whether the intervention is having any sort of significant impact or not. Okay, so the one study that I did really want to highlight was this landmark 2019 study by Kevin Hall. Kevin Hall is um, a superstar in health research, and I would highly recommend most of the research that he has done for you to read. A lot of it is conducted at the highest level. It's very meticulous. Nutrition research is notoriously a mess. Um, and in my mind, Kevin Hall and his teams, they've probably done one of the best jobs, if not the best job, of actually conducting that research in a way that we can actually parse out things most accurately. So, Kevin Hall, good guy. Um, so his sort of trial in 2019, basically what they did was they randomly assigned people to an ultra processed food heavy diet or an unprocessed diet for 2 weeks each, following an ad lib diet where they were provided basically cooked meals and said eat as much as you want. They found that the participants who were on the UPF diet ate roughly an additional 500 calories per day more on that diet and ended up gaining weight. So, importantly, that wasn't actually because of additives or emulsifiers, but rather it was more down to what they theorized was faster eating speeds, the calorie density of the UPFs, and palatability. Um, so basically, the minimally processed food group, and whenever they swapped over, they found that they tended to eat slower, eat less, and the foods weren't as palatable. So flip that on its head, and it's pretty easy to see as to why you would see an energy increase. And that was the average. So some people there would be a lot more, some people there would be a lot less, but that would be the average. So similar data has also been discovered in further studies comparing UPF to minimally processed foods, even when comparing high protein foods. And there's a couple of the studies there that you might want to go and have a look at. Now, again, the the real life sort of extrapolations from that are not massive, but they're still significant. So you will see increased UPF intake even with these sort of higher protein snack foods. But again, those are in ad lib diets. Those are not people who have got calorie controlled diets. Those are not people who are adhering to any sort of plan. It's just a bit freelance. So it's always important to kind of like understand that. Um, because it's like you've given, I suppose, without having the sort of the energy foundation of the diet to begin with, it's a bit like just giving people a whole host of bricks and just saying make whatever house you want. Some people make a great big house, some people make a very little house, depends on the person. So, but it just seems to be that with the UPS in particular, if you're not controlling for energy intake, people do tend to overeat. Okay, so whilst UPS may not be the entire problem, they do seem to be maybe a potential part of the problem, at least as far as weight management and health is concerned. Because, of course, if weight management is not well controlled, you do tend to see health issues with that. That's not controversial. Um, but there are a number of reasons why these foods could be problematic that aren't necessarily related to them being processed or not. Okay, and this is more to do with how the foods are formulated in a way, and I don't like to use the word constructed because that makes them seem even more artificial, but how these foods are produced. Okay, so UPFs and potential health mechanisms. So the first and foremost, it's got to be the hyperpalatability. Now, again, not all UPFs are hyperpalatable, but a lot of the ones that we associate as not being great for us are. So these combinations of fat, sugar, and salt make these foods highly rewarding, and it encourages overconsumption. So you're thinking crisps, pizza, ice cream, pastries, biscuits, sweets, chocolates, whatever. That's sort of if you ask someone what's a UPF, they're probably going to outline one of them. A lot of these foods tend to be more energy dense, basically just meaning you're getting a relatively low food volume for the amount of calories that you're consuming. The food structure is another big one. So a lot of these foods are actually designed to be more easier to eat. It's one of the reasons why, in particular, I wouldn't be a massive fan of UPFs in children, just because there is a lot less auto-regulation in children. They tend to overeat a wee bit more because they're essentially it's like if a dog gets in the bin, so you just need to be mindful of that. The nutrient composition. So again, depends on the UPF in question, but I would say for the most part, you'll tend to see, with the popular UPFs, if you're not talking about those that maybe are created and designed with um, to be sort of beneficial to health in mind, or at least to kind of serve in that field, you will see a nutrient composition which favors more added sugars, less healthy fats, more saturated, more trans fats, um, and more than likely they might have like a low quality protein source or something in there. Like they could use like gelatin or something like that, but not great, not great. So it's important to be able to read the labels for those two. Of course, you then have the emulsifiers and the additives, and again, their impact on our health is hotly contested. I would say, however, for the most part, you would need to have an awful lot of these things for it to be a problem. And I like north of 50% of your diet sounds like a lot. You would need to have even more than that, especially if you're talking about added sweeteners. You like the amount you would need to have for those to be of concern would be astronomical. You're talking north of like 6, 7, 8 liters of Coke per day, every day, on a continual basis. For there to be a potential risk of there being, a fraction of a increased risk of an issue. The biggest issue you're going to have with that is losing your teeth. So just be mindful of that. These foods could be potentially less nutritious. They're designed for reward, not just in how hyper palatable they are, but how a lot of them, look, how easy they are to digest. Just important to keep a wee note of that. Also, you have to look at the packaging too. The packaging is like, whoa, and this is one of the big issues that they have with kids as well, is a lot of this packaging is like, wow, you know. So just be mindful of that too. And then the texture and the eating speed. So the softer textures, the structures like I mentioned, and these sort of engineered food matrices reduce the chewing time, bypass natural satiety cues. People then end up eating UPFs faster, delays fullness signals, and encourages overeating. Okay, so there are some of the reasons as to why UPFs may not be great. But again, all of this falls under the umbrella of these not being within a calorie controlled diet. Okay, cool. So let's explore socioeconomic and accessibility issues. What an exciting title. But no, this is an important conversation to have. These are more nuanced conversations, and one of the reasons why a case could be made for UPFs, and maybe we shouldn't be so quick to point the fingers at them. Okay, so not all UPFs are bad. In fact, one could argue that for many people, they have become a necessity in an ever worsening cost of living crisis. UPFs are cheap, calorie dense, and shelf stable. That those are essential qualities for families on tight budgets or independents on tight budgets. You're looking at folks who are on very restricted um well, budgets, it's not just like families that you're thinking of, you're also thinking of potentially elderly folks as well, people who can't even afford the heat and they have to choose between food or freezing to death, which is a lovely place that our government has, put them in. But just important to know that a lot of these foods can be lifesavers for these folks. So asking people to just cook from scratch ignores real barriers like cost, time, and energy. And while it might be easy for the 20 to 30 something middle class influencer with no responsibilities, for the family that is pushed to breaking point financially, with little space, equipment, or cooking skills, as well as a limited budget, it's a much different set of circumstances and one that's not often met with compassion. And this is just one example to highlight among many, many other groups and demographics that are more reliant on UPFs. And yet we have these influencers who are wagging their fingers saying, you need to learn how to cook better. You need to do this. You need to do that. Oh, look, I've taken £100 and I've got a week's worth of shopping. Why can't you do that? Not realizing that that £100 would have to be the shopping for the month. So there's a real disconnect, you know. But influencers don't actually live in the real world to begin with. I need to be careful because I'm on the borderline of being one. I would say with the amount of coffee I consume, maybe I don't live in the real world, but that's not because of social media. That's just, caffeine. But I think, just be very careful what you're taking on board from influencers. Okay. They might have great big audiences, but the size of an audience does not guarantee expertise. There are plenty of idiots who have big audiences. It's why we used to have, the village idiots or the court jesters. They might have a big audience, but you're not necessarily going to them for advice a lot of the time. So you're not. So, but now they get lots of money, which, the world's gone mad. But sure. One of the other things to consider is the accessibility factor. So, in certain parts of the world, there exist what are described as food deserts. These are often remote areas of the world whereby transportation to and from is difficult and resources are in short supply most often. In these places, UPFs might be the only option. So, demonizing them can stigmatize individuals who don't have alternatives, and that stigma carries very real risk as well. Public health campaigns and influencers slash the media that label UPFs as poison or toxic can worsen shame, especially in low income groups, without offering realistic solutions. This can actually lead to worse health outcomes rather than prompting change, which is why which I'd like to think is the goal behind these entirely ignorant purity pushes. So I had to read that word for word because I thought, you know what, Jamie, that was a good slide. If I do say so myself, that was a good slide that you had wrote. Um, but yeah, the stigma issue is a massive, massive problem. And that extends to all manner of fields. I mean, I would say one of the more popular fields where stigma actually seems to worsen the condition is in obesity, where you see that as people receive critical social messaging, whether in a more wider, um, you know, social manner or more localized, whether that could be from partner, family member, people at work, friends, whatever, um, it actually makes the condition worse because they tend to regress back into those unhealthy behaviors that then further drive obesity in the first place, or they get into isolation, and isolation is horrendous. Like we are not meant to be isolated. And so pushing that stigma onto those people, it's a cruel thing that does no good. I put it very simply, I've never met anyone who's ever been bullied healthy before, right? Now you might bully someone into losing a bit of weight. You might bully someone into going to the gym. You might bully someone into making certain food choices, but they're not necessarily healthy at the end of the day, because they're in a bit of a mental battle. And I can speak from experience, not because I've been the bully, because I've been on the other side of it. So just be very careful, how I'm not saying you, but just how we talk to people. We just need to be careful, because you never know what influence you're having on someone. So you just be mindful of that and never stigmatize someone for having to make the choices that they have no real other solution other than those choices. So, and then the final wee thing to cover, again, in the nuanced sort of conversations, is the importance of messaging. So policy, stakeholders, influencers, and the media needs to consider that UPF serve important roles in food security. So a nuanced approach would be better focused on improving UPFs rather than trying to eliminate them altogether, which I doubt would even be a realistic solution at this stage. We simply wouldn't be able to produce the food that these people talk about. Not everyone can have a wild caught fish or like a steak for dinner every night, with homegrown vegetables and stuff like that. No one like how are we going to produce that for millions and millions of people? How are we going to produce that? It's not billions of people. How are we going to produce that? It's just not realistic. And I think some people just live in a different reality altogether than the one that actually exists. So the messaging matters. I think the push needs to be for better quality UPS rather than trying to eradicate them altogether. And then the final part I want to talk about is context and dose. This is the common sense section of the presentation. So, not all UPFs are equal, obviously. So, while it is popular to approach subjects with a black and white perspective, social media, it is rarely, if ever, helpful or useful when it comes to nutrition and health. So, for instance, with UPFs, they're clearly not all the same. A high protein Greek yogurt with sweeteners is technically UPF, but it provides calcium, protein, probiotics, and it's convenient. Compare that to something similar, like any of those sort of like generic wee like chocolate mousse style products on the shelf or in the fridges. They're also UPF, but without the potential same nutritional upside. So they're packed with more sugars, less protein, more sweeteners. I doubt they're going to have any sort of probiotic benefit. The fat quality is probably pretty poor as well. And they're going to have a lot more sweeteners added to them, and would not really, for most people, help move towards daily nutrition targets. Now, it's not to say that you can't have them. It's just those two things are UPFs, but clearly one is not the same, right? It's like saying, um, oh, well, both of those teams are in the Premier League, but one of them's Man United and one of them's Liverpool. Okay, as a Man United fan, I can tell you, not the same as Liverpool right now. They might exist in the same league. They might be both Premiership clubs. Not the same. Man United, down here. You hear me, Man United? You are down here. Disappointing. Liverpool are up here. So that's just what I want to say about that. So even though they have the same label, same categorization, they're not the same, So it's really important to be able to contextualize that and look at each UPF that you're talking about, that you're looking at, on a case by case basis. So it is. So dose is also important. So as I mentioned earlier, the British diet is now dominated by UPFs, and this sort of link, this north of 50% of our total calorie intake now being contributed by UPFs, that has been linked with health risks and issues with weight management efforts. However, occasional UPFs in the context of an otherwise nutrient-dense diet are unlikely to matter or be of any consequence. That is why when a collection of popular influencers launch a campaign targeting protein bars, which I would describe as being like a bridge food for people moving towards a more nutritious overall diet, or simply a food that they can use that will keep them sane, but also help them contribute to move towards their nutrition goals. They're entirely missing the forest for the tree. And that's a very small tree, maybe a blade of grass. Having the odd protein bar or, anything that kind of falls within that category that contributes towards your nutritional targets, or any kind of UPF that helps keep you sane, will, and I'll stake my reputation on this, have no ill effect on you. And in fact, I would argue, and I even bet on it, that including them in that fashion would actually move you towards a healthier, happier version of yourself overall. Let's look for push for change. So I know it's trendy to highlight that UPFs are bad, but they're here to stay, and whether they're bad or not, as unhelpful as these labels are, depends on a case by case, moment by moment basis, all to do with context. So instead of just giving them this black and white label, we should invest our we should invest our energy towards policies to reduce salt, trans fats, and added sugars, and continue to make a lot of these UPFs maybe less potentially harmful than they are or that they once were, and continue to improve the quality of them. To continue to sort of strong arm global organizations to not sort of put profit over people, to encourage further reformulation efforts, and essentially to make UPFs more nutrient dense and more beneficial to the wider public, as opposed to, like I said, just trying to fill up the pockets of stakeholders and the tippity top of these companies who seem to get richer and richer and richer as people get sicker and sicker and sicker. And then one of the other things I just want to touch on very finally here are some of the other potential pitfalls of demonizing UPFs for our health and well-being. So food guilt, which I sort of touched on earlier in my sort of personal experience with that. So demonizing UPFs, demonizing any foods to be quite honest, but demonizing UPFs can fuel restrictive mindsets, orthorexia, or binge restrict cycles. So for someone working on food freedom, their relationship with food, strict UPF avoidance can actually backfire and cause more issues. There's also the sort of the social link, the social role that we have, along with UPFs. So UPFs are embedded in our culture. Birthday cake, cinema popcorn, ice cream on a sunny day, pizzas, pizza night. Who doesn't want to have a pizza night? The social connection matters as much as the nutrients. And, quite frankly, life is too short to not just enjoy it sometimes. So, and I know people will say, oh, well, I can enjoy it without those things. Well, that's very good for you. That's very good for you, you know, but no one cares. Everyone else wants to, have more freedom with their life, to be able to enjoy these things in a more balanced fashion and not be told that they are the worst person on the planet for doing so. So, shut up next time. And then we have flexibility versus rigidity. So for long-term health, moderation and inclusion are usually almost always better strategies than elimination. A mindset of better but not perfect prevents the all or nothing trap. And actually, I would say that making the best possible decision is the perfect decision, which is also context dependent. Perfect is not an external measurement. Perfect is you just making the best possible decision in that moment. And that is going to be the one that contributes to the healthiest, happiest future. Sometimes that is just having the thing that you want and enjoying it, and then just moving on, right? Because if you don't have that, it could have a knock-on effect. You could end up binging then later on because you didn't have it. Much worse option, right? So then the final point is the psychological relief. So sometimes UPFs provide comfort, ease, and pleasure, important aspects of well-being that shouldn't be dismissed outright. Now, obviously, you don't want to let that spiral into comfort eating and that being the only tool in your toolbox for sort of navigating the world and all its problems. However, again, just enjoying these things the odd time is totally fine. If you've had an absolutely manic day and you have a chocolate bar, the world is not going to stop spinning. It's not going to ruin your entire diet. It's totally fine, especially if you're actually making um making the effort to include that, within a laid out planned and structured diet. That is the best approach you can take, not to just restrict it because so and so said so online. So in conclusion, I'll wrap this up very quickly. So, the debate around ultra processed foods and weight management really shows how complex this topic is. There's no simple good or bad, no matter what those people on social media are telling you. The NOVA classification, whilst useful, often simplifies things by putting nutrient-rich foods like fortified cereals or plant-based milks in the same categories as crisps and sweets. That ignores how important convenience foods can be for people who are short on time or money. I think the best comparison I can think of with the NOVA classification system is that and BMI, right? It was never meant to be used for individual foods or case by case basis. It's just for grouping. The same way BMI was always meant to be used for more public health issues. It was never meant to be used to, oh, your individual BMI is this, this, this. And it's like you're talking to, like an Ireland international rugby player. I do think they'll probably be slightly heavier than the prescribed BMI, but they're also a world-class athlete who runs up and down the pitch, countless times a day, carries a huge amount of muscle, and is extremely fit. It's not quite the same. So, but again, that's just misuse of a tool, which happens quite a lot. From my own experience, I also learned that trying to completely avoid UPFs in the name of clean eating led to orthorexia, a reminder that rigidity around food can be just as harmful as overconsumption. Moderation and flexibility matter far more than society's idea of perfection, which does not exist, because someone will always try and push it further, and then you get into the likes of anorexia and things like that. And that's obviously not a healthy place to be. The real opportunity lies in improving the quality of UPFs, so reformulating them to lower sugar, salt, and fats, and enhance their nutritional value with things like fiber, omega-3s, or probiotics. Plant-based meats are a good example. They raise valid debates about nutrition, but they can also contribute to environmental goals, and there's also obviously the moral element of that. Now, I wouldn't be a big fan of the plant-based meats, to be quite honest. I would probably direct you more to maybe like a tofu or something like that. But I think if we can push to, again, improve the formulation of those things, it's for the better for the people who choose to have them. Ultimately, policy and public messaging should focus on balance. We should promote reducing overall reliance on UPFs while improving the ones people do eat. Blanket labels like toxic or poison or anything like that don't help anyone and risk alienating those who rely on affordable, convenient options. If I've learned anything, it's that sustainable weight management and a healthier, happier overall approach to nutrition and well-being comes from a place of flexibility, cultural awareness, and equitable access to better food, not from dogma or fear. So, a lovely little conclusion. Hopefully, the presentation was helpful. Again, it's important to be able to understand these foods, important to understand what might be the underlying mechanisms that people tend to be a wee bit sort of about. Because then the more that you understand it, the more you can make informed choices on it. Now, hopefully, the section on context and dose really helped. I think that's just to sort of elucidate the fact that having these things the odd time just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Even having it once per day, if you're having a protein bar a day, if you're having like a little protein yogurt per day, if you're having a biscuit per day, if that's within a structured plan, or a healthy overall lifestyle where you're not binge drinking, you're getting to bed on time, you're moving on a daily basis. It's fine. It's absolutely fine. And again, please, please, please don't let influencers try and sway you into what they're telling you is a healthier overall approach, but just leaves you being more confused. And then you end up having to spend money on whatever they're trying to sell you, because that is no good for anyone. All right. So, any questions, send them across, and hopefully the presentation was helpful.